ego that led to the fix we're in now. What led to Senator Joseph McCarthy? Now, forget whether you like him or whether you don't like him. What led to him? Why was it that 6 years went by after World War II before a leading United States senator took up the cudgels of anti-communism? How in the world did Joseph McCarthy ever get close to spearheading the anti-communist cause? Where were all the hundreds of liberal leaders who should have stood between Senator Joseph McCarthy and anti-communism? Where were all the liberals between 1945 and 1951 who said, whoops, sorry, America, we didn't lie, but we were dumb. We trusted Stalin. We called him Uncle Joe. We agreed to be his parole officers. We agreed that we would sort of stand up for him. He was not supposed to disappoint. Really, we're sorry. No. They pretended they weren't looking, you see, and that's why anti-communism got off to such a bad start, because the liberals were paralyzed with embarrassment at what Joseph Stalin did after World War II. What's not true?
Hubert Humphrey gave a speech before the ADA a year before Joe McCarthy started really making his moves, and said exactly the same thing that you're saying right now. I mean, there were liberals who were making the strong side. The first one. In fact, he didn't know what a communist was until he needed to run for re-election and was going to lose in Wisconsin.
That look on your face scarce of liberals who were merely embarrassed that Joseph Stalin turned in a Hitler kind of way. They pretended, I don't know how we got so far from Norman Mailer, but trust me, I will get back.
I'm shaking my head.
No, I will get back.
You're assuming that all this McCarthy dug up was valid when most of it wasn't.
Matters not.
I mean, he stole from John Kennedy, for God's sake. He stole John Kennedy was making speeches on the House floor, the same thing.
Matters not. Well, look, believe me, ego paralyzed anti-communism among the liberals. The liberals should have been the first anti-communists, but so many of them had vouched for Joseph Stalin that they could not face us when Joseph Stalin began to behave like Adolf Hitler. They pretended to look the other way.
There's nothing that unravels faster than an analogy that's not accepted by your guests. And this one's unraveling.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you, David. Nothing unravels faster than my guests who are unaccepted by an analogy.
That could be. That could be.
All right, fine. We have one guest who comes up with a Hubert Humphrey. Where were the other liberals between 1945, the engineers on my side, between 1945 and but he can cut me off, and you too. Where were the liberals in Washington between 1945 and 1951?
Well, that's the whole point of what I just said. Hubert Humphrey made a speech before the ADA where he said, "Where the hell are you?"
No, one swallowed.
I've been screaming. He says, we just can't let this thing go on. And of course, and he urged them he urged the liberal community to give up their pride and the rest of it and get moving.
But they did.
And they didn't. And Joe McCarthy stepped in.
Okay, well, you've proven my point.
You're underestimating both McCarthy and Mailer if you think it was just ego, because it was an enormous current of opportunism.
No.
And financial.
Just remember, we haven't even introduced the show yet.
Wait a minute. The liberals not apologizing for their approval of Joseph Stalin, letting dominoes fall until Joe McCarthy, Republican, 1951, Wisconsin senator, became the leader of anti-communism. There were at least 100 liberals who should have taken that cause, but ego paralyzed them all. Hubert Humphrey, the exception. Norman Mailer went to bat for
It was not a novel.
It's non-fiction.
Yeah,
definitely a writer.
Book.
Start again.
Let's start. Norman Mailer went to bat for a white jailed writer.
Definitely a writer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's been confirmed.
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
I don't know. I read the book. I'm not.
Threw a party for him and said that this man has culture and he's good for mankind, and I want to help him. And then he killed again. And instead of doing what normal people do, who among us has not gone to bat for a bad person?
Killing is something else. Norman Mailer standing there in front of these television cameras the other day and saying, all right, so he killed somebody. So we'll put him in a prison for a couple of years, but we've got to let him out. Art must thrive in this country. Culture must thrive. We can't stifle it. This person has to be let out.
Did he say anything about the victim at all?
No,
I didn't see any
somebody, there was a reporter
I didn't see anything.
I have never seen a situation where reporters lost their cool as much as that when Mailer was standing outside that courtroom. And one reporter, yells out in the back, well, isn't one person dead enough to prove to you that you made a mistake? I mean, he killed once, you let him out, he kills again, and now you're saying let him out again? He says, you've got to take a chance. Art must thrive in this country. This is totally different than somebody's feeling, for God's sake. Because you have pencils, you have pens, and you have typewriters, and I guess they let them all...
Remember that if this man wrote this book while he was in jail, he can now write a second book during the next 25 years. Being in jail didn't stop him from writing this wonderful book.
Second
His literary,
too,
Genet wrote in jail. Many Papillon wrote in jail. Many people were able to write in jail. And now he's going to have the opportunity of not being distracted with literary tease. One of the things that I could not understand Norman Mailer saying is that you should feel sorry for him because... an author, he said, I can tell you when your book comes out is an exciting and disturbing experience. Between the publication and the book, the publicity that accompanies it is unsettling time. Now, I think some of us around here have written books, and I don't think that any of us did anything more than maybe have 3 hot dogs when we got terribly excited.
A quotation from the famous book that Mr. What's his name? Abbott allegedly has written. I say allegedly because these days you have to say what you read in the paper. Here's the quote. And this is the book he wrote when he was in prison, and I think he had already been convicted of murder. Quote, you slipped out a knife, 8 to 10-inch blade, double-edged, and you're holding it beside your leg so he can't see it. The enemy is smiling and chattering away about something. A light pivot toward him with your right shoulder, and the world turns upside down. You sunk the knife to its hilt into the middle of his chest. It cuts like hot melted butter. Slowly he begins to struggle for his life, and as he sinks, you have to kill him fast or get caught, and you can feel his life trembling through the knife in your hand. It almost overcomes you, and then he says, please, unquote. Now this is what the man said, by the way.
David, when it was reported during the trial, you would imagine that Abbott would have felt somewhat embarrassed. Instead, he said, it's good, isn't it?
I think the angriest I've gotten, I've never met Jimmy Wexler. I met him in 1952 when I was a boy editor from a college, and he was in a war with Walter Winchell and our hero. I would like to meet Mr. Wexler. Mr. Wexler said something. I am Al Lowenstein's great admirer and friend. He was gunned down insanely in March 1980. People say, you were Al Lowenstein's friend, incandescent liberal, you're an arch-conservative. I'm sorry William F. Buckley Jr. beat me to the punch in endorsing Allard K. Lowenstein for Congress. William F. Buckley Jr. endorsed Allard K. Lowenstein because Bill Buckley senses something that is all too missing in American politics. It's not only, is the guy running on your side, but what is the guy running? Is he a mensch? Is he a nerd? Is he a milk dud? Is he a tent peg? Is he a rutabaga? Is he a lux? And I would rather have a mensch who is on the other side ideologically, who works 20 hours a day for his constituents pragmatically, than a milk dud totally on my side politically. And I just envy Bill Buckley for having the charisma, the brains, the guts, and the wisdom to stand up for Allard K. Lowenstein when it counted. Now, the one thing that got me angriest was when Allard Lowenstein was shot, Jimmy Wexler said in his column that if the guy who shot him was named Sweeney, one of Allard Lowenstein's protégés from earlier civil rights wars in Mississippi and a lot of elsewheres, and Sweeney went totally insane. He had some dental work, and Allard Lowenstein helped him pay for the dental work. And Sweeney thought that Allard Lowenstein had sold out to the CIA and had the CIA implant secret transmitters in Sweeney's teeth, okay? Are we talking about something real? And Sweeney didn't like Allard Lowenstein helping the CIA plant transmitters in his teeth, so he made an appointment to see Al, and of course Al was receptive and willing and loving as always. Sweeney went in, Allard put his arm around him. Sweeney fired 6 shots into Al. And, you know, Al was a health nut. He almost survived the 6 shots, full in the gut. And Sweeney didn't try to escape. He put the gun on the secretary's desk and sat down and waited for the police to harvest him. And Jimmy Wexler wrote, if Allard were alive, he'd be down at the station house trying to arrange bail for Sweeney.
Miss Barry, this is that you're dealing really desperately sick. I mean, anyone that thinks the CIA has implanted little radios or whatever it is in his teeth, I mean, you're not dealing with that. With Abbott, you are dealing with a sane man who has a violent temper and uses it. You were dealing with...
You and David Schulte were having a contest on who misses my point more. It would need King Solomon to come down to decide who is the winner. I was talking about James Wexler's comment about Allard. He thought he was praising the memory of Allard Lowenstein.
Do you think he was praising the memory?
Oh, sure he was. He thought he was.
No, do you think that memory is praisable that he mentioned?
I talked to Al Lowenstein while he lived from 1949 until just before he was killed, and I try to fantasize. Al, how do you like that Jimmy Wexler comment? And I must be on Wexler's side. I think Al would have smiled and said, forgive Jimmy, he means well.
Point, and I'd like to get back to it. The Abbotts, that's one problem. This is the criminal who has been released. But I really believe that the main part of this program was going to be on the Mailers, not the Abbotts. This is going to be a separate problem. We have to deal with Abbotts, the judges and the parole officers and so on. That's a separate problem. But it's the Mailers that make us worry, because there are so many more Mailers than there are Abbotts. And it's the Mailers, I think, that can negate all of the law and order that we're trying to put in. Now, I agree with you, and I'd like to get back and get more thinking on this from everybody else.
Could I ask?
That regardless what a criminal does, that someone has to find some excuse to justify what he did and say, this is the reason why he has committed. Now, this is not compassion. We're not talking about compassion. That's something else. This is the person who seeks out whether the man has artistic ability or the man came from a broken home.
Bernie Gittleson is speaking great truth. I don't care how much you ridicule me. One day, the Analogy Foundation in Alsace-Lorraine...
And I'll be the vice president.
The Analogy Foundation from Alsace-Lorraine will single me out for an award for linking up Mailer Abbott and liberals' communism right after World War II. The liberals were so ego-tortured by Joseph Stalin becoming another Hitler that they pretended not to notice, and when you challenged them, they called you a red baiter. The liberals from 1945 to Joe McCarthy and after Joe McCarthy did not say, shucks, you're right, we did trust, and I did call him Uncle Joe. We did have great, yeah, I guess we were wrong. No, the liberal did not do that when you said, what about the subjugation of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia? No, the liberal didn't say that. The liberal turned around and called you a red baiter. Now, turn the page. Maybe the analogies are better the second time around. Norman Mailer did not say, yeah, I guess I went to bed. I'm sorry he disappointed all of us, and I'm sorry he killed again. No, not at all. Norman Mailer said, I'd help him again. We need...
That's the whole... The book and the publicity that accompanied it was an unsettling time. Now listen to the rest of the quote. In some publicity accounts, Abbott read that his mother was a prostitute and that he was a homosexual. Now, this is important. But what bothered... This is Norman Mailer. But what bothered him, Abbott, the most was being described as 5'7" when he's actually 5'11". Now, isn't that a great excuse for killing somebody? That's a newspaper account called you 4 inches shorter than you are?
You talk about frequently said as the most leftist person I ever campaigned for actively. She is my president. In a way, she's the president of AFTRA, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. Are you laughing because I campaigned? Are you embarrassed that I announced my support?
No, I'm laughing at your phrase leftist. I don't feel leftist. I feel very middle of the road.
Good. Nobody does anymore. It means things are moving our way.
You backed universal suffrage, didn't you?
Louis Armstrong. We up there and did so many great things. When anybody asked Louis Armstrong what's new, he always smiled and said, "White folks still in the lead." So when anybody asks me what's new, I just say, Anne Loring says she's middle of the road.
True.
Because the press has given Norman Mailer a free ride by not pointing out the most important fact, which is some 10 years or so ago, at a party that I was at, Norman Mailer plunged a knife into his wife's stomach. You are half right. It was not 10 years ago.
I don't know about the time, but
it was
maybe
19. More. No. The reason I could tell you the exact date because I never really met Norm Mailer, but I was supposed to meet Norman Mailer on my radio show, and he could not make it because he stabbed his wife that night and was answering questions.
Regardless of the date, I was at the party, though, and that's when I met Norman Mailer. The point is that Norman pleaded, in a way, the same defense that he's pleading for Abbott. His lawyer, anyway, pleaded it for him.
What was that?
That he was a great artist and that he deserved consideration. And so, therefore, what an ordinary wife stabber would have gotten at least a couple of years, Norman walked out without any penalty at all. And maybe now he's sort of trying to return that favor. Well, certainly he must identify. If that knife had been as long as the knife that Abbott used, Norman would have been up for murder. He happened to use a short knife.
Well, she was talking about victims. There are no victims anymore. People, we only have criminals, but nobody is the victim because we don't remember the victim. We don't care about
we're all the victims. We are the victims.
No, who cares? Victims. No, we only care about why somebody did it, the sociological and the reasons, and we have to really feel sorry for him. And in this case, as Norman Mailer points out, poor guy was being reported as 5'7" when he was 5'11".
Well, also, I think
I use the argument so often that I can understand people trying to get away with it. I mean, we use the argument with Richard Nixon. Should Richard Nixon go to jail after he suffered enough? He was president of the United States. You can't put the president in jail. They said that about. You say that about a lot of people. Harrison Williams is going around saying that about him. I was a great senator. I don't belong in jail.
Let's not talk about a different type of crime.
And it's got to stop. There's no excuse for committing a crime. I don't care if you're 5'11". I don't care if you're the president of the United States. I don't care if you're the world's greatest author, or if your name is Michelangelo. If you commit a crime, you belong in jail. And
they're calling up and saying, "Are we ever going to talk about biorhythm?" Well, if we're up to me, we never would. No, we never would, Bernie. I don't believe in it. I think it's Swiss. I think it's tacky. But Bernard Gittleson has built a career on biorhythm. His latest book, How to Make Your Own Luck, relies on biorhythm. And if Bernie Gittleson is man enough to pull out clippings of Norman Mailer and immerse himself in that subject because he knew I was interested in that, and I am, for the moment, going to be interested in biorhythm.
Well, we won't. No. The first one was George Tomer, believe in biorhythm. You didn't believe in astrology when I first computerized astrology.
No. With Jane Alpert, growing up underground is your recollection of your days from when you were blowing up banks and trying to overthrow America up to today. When you were doing all that, had you known that in this year that we're in right now, America would look like and live like it is right now, and Poland would look like and live like it is right now, and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, would you have thrown those bombs, or would you have waited?
That's one of those questions that you can't say yes or no to, because if I say, no, I wouldn't have done it then, in the way you phrase the question, that suggests that I would do it now, which I wouldn't. I mean, the change I've undergone in the last 10 years has to do, I think, not so much with the change in my political views as with my feelings about how you can be effective in expressing their political views and
the issues that they talked about. Mm-hmm. I mean, what did a kid like, your point is well made. Obviously, the kids that went into the anti-Vietnam business were doing it for other reasons, having very little to do with Vietnam. I used to be on the teach-in circuit, and they knew virtually nothing about Vietnam.
No, you just said it's to completely negate the political. But I think if the Vietnam War, I know if the Vietnam War hadn't taken place. I know if we'd had a president who had been responsive to protest and to the feelings of American youth about that war.
Was he supposed to be responsive to the majority of the people who supported the war right up until the end?
Well,
I mean, when you say responsive, what do you mean? You mean to that little elite that you belong to that thought that they should run the world?
Well, at the very least, I mean that he shouldn't have been cutting off access to constitutional forms of dissent as he was.
Which kinds of constitutional forms did he cut off?
I mean, he shouldn't have been sending out his plumbers to break into the psychiatrists of people
First
who
of
work
all,
for
when
his
you were
administration.
doing that, you didn't know anything about the plumbers, and the plumbers case we could go into all night. It didn't break until after you were doing the bombing. That's for openers. So that has nothing to do with the reason that you were involved.
But see, the people in Poland know that their government is oppressive to them, even if they don't know every detail of what that government is doing to carry out oppression.
They know the details. They look on the corner. There's cops.
We knew that the Pentagon, that the body counts were being put out that were put out from Vietnam.
Why was that a reason to throw bombs?
We knew. Now, you're just jumping to a whole other part of the argument. I'm not
you're giving me the reason.
No.
Let's hear it.
Now what you're doing, you're saying that, okay, because I'm arguing politically, now you're going to argue with me politically, and you're going to negate the personal. I'm not trying to justify the fact that I was involved in bombings. I'm trying to explain that there were two streams that came together in the late 60s for me and other American youth. And I'm trying to say that part of it was the Vietnam War and Nixon's illegal measures of cutting off dissent, measures which were recognized as illegal in the 70s.
Illegal forms of dissent that you were not allowed.
Well, another one was the demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
Which were planned to cause riots.
Demonstrations which were declared police riots by an investigating commission,
and
for which police were never convicted. The eight of the most important leaders of the anti-war
What was it that they wanted to do that
leaders,
was legal that they were not allowed to do?
they wanted to express the dissent of an enormous number of American people, particularly American youth who were being drafted in that war, against the nomination of a war candidate
Were they
at the
told that they
Democratic
couldn't
National
walk on the
Convention.
streets, carry signs, and do all of the legal things that any law-abiding citizen could do?
They didn't have to be told. They were physically beaten up to stop them from doing it, and I saw it on my own. I wasn't there. I saw it on my own television set.
Excuse me. They were stopped from breaking the laws of Chicago by having demonstrations in areas that they were not supposed to have them.
Well, I saw them on television. I don't know where you were, but I saw kids who were not yippies or advocating violence of any kind, who were simply supporters of Eugene McCarthy, who were being beaten up by the police, and I saw...
They were being beaten up after what
and I saw senators standing up inside the Democratic National Convention
you were
saying
around
they
in those
couldn't continue
days.
that
Are you
convention
telling me that the
because
people...
of the riot that was going on in the streets.
Were those riots planned or not planned by the people who were on your side of the fence?
I wasn't at those demonstrations.
I'm asking your opinion. Tell me a straight answer. Did those people mean to start a riot? Did they mean to get some poor innocent kids up in the front of the line, break the law, and force a confrontation where the cops had really no choice but to have a fight?
I don't live inside their minds. I'm not going to presume to tell you what other people had in their minds.
You knew the people that planned the situation. Are you telling me that they didn't plan? The same people
They were people I admired. I respected their political points of view. I'd heard what they had to say.
Allowed to demonstrate
I'm not going to tell you what went on
any
inside their minds.
sensible reason. They were allowed to demonstrate. They wanted to demonstrate to the point of stopping.
Can I
the
bust in here a little
bit?
Room for an cannot escape that impression of American revolutionaries. I am accustomed to revolutionaries who face consequences. I am accustomed to Norwegian resistors against Adolf Hitler who knew good and well that if they were caught, they would not go to jail and get paroled and write a book. They'd be put up against a wall and shot. I am accustomed to anti-communist resistors in the communist world who know the self-same thing. I'm a little bit puzzled. The word underground press. The word, well, Charlie, don't laugh. The word ghetto. I don't like the word ghetto. I mean, not as a political person, as somebody who loves language. I can't stand the American utilization of the word ghetto. You know what ghetto means. You did not get out of the Warsaw Ghetto by taking the A train. And as far as the underground press is concerned, to me the underground press is the Norwegian resistance newsletters where the Nazis shot you if you had ink on your hands.
I don't know, you're doing pretty well with the spoken word.
I hope you will too. But I think it must be maddening to be a revolutionary in a society that doesn't quite need a revolution. And I still feel that American revolutionaries are toy revolutionaries.
You have to take a couple steps back here. That's not in the context of the 60s, and America was involved in a war in Vietnam. And many of the people who were out demonstrating.
And there was total dissent. There were major newspapers that opposed the war. There were political figures in the open who opposed the war. May I repeat my last comment? It must be maddening to be a revolutionary in a society that doesn't quite need a revolution.
Barry, the greatest example was the little boys from Columbia and these other schools, all these little tin horn revolutionaries that carried Mao Zedong's picture and Che Guevara's picture in their wallets. And I remember when they decided to go down and shut down Wall Street. They were going to shut down Wall Street. And they all knew that power came out of the barrel of a gun and, power to the people. And they went down to Wall Street, and Teddy Gleason's ILA decided that they were going to keep Wall Street open that day, and a bunch of those longshoremen went down there, and boom! And those little wimps cried and wept, all power out of the barrel of a cannon, but please, Mr. Policeman, save me from the longshoremen. For God's sake, Che Guevara was spinning in his grave. Two-bit slob can be a revolutionary in a free and open society. It's a phony term. Revolutionaries over here don't exist.
Ben Wattenberg and Sidney Zion are with me on opposite microphones. David Schulte is on his normal microphone.
And the Democrats say, I mean, a lot of this big argument that's going on is much less of an argument than it seems on the outside. So that there might be some economic health down the road. At least what the Democrats and what the Reaganauts are saying is not that far apart. Reagan's guys call it supply side. The Democrats under Carter, they called it reindustrialization. They're all talking about the same thing, which is the economy has been kind of flabby, kind of sick. It's got to get reinvigorated, and the way you do it is to stop beating up on the private sector. Even the liberals have come to understand that no matter how humane and how compassionate you want to be, you cannot fund a welfare state without a vigorous and healthy private sector. So you now really have a consensus. This is what happened in the spring of 81, the summer of 81. The Democrats, for all the great Sturm and Drang about fat cats and trickle-downs and Trojan horses and every other damn thing, basically put up a program that was about as Reaganautic as Reaganomics. And then, as is our want in politics, the press kind of concentrated on the 10% of the difference. But there really is, what I've been writing and saying is that there really is sort of a new consensus in Washington, Democrats and Republicans. There is some differences. But, it's very interesting. I saw on the Democratic rebuttal program yesterday, I don't know if you saw that, the canned thing that they did after the State of the Union. It was vigorously critical of certain things that are going on in the country, unemployment particularly. But here, after a decade and a half of the most divisive, vigorously combated activity within the Democratic Party about the issue of national defense and foreign policy, there was not one word in that half-hour program critical of a president who came in and has ratcheted up the defense budget to unheard-of levels. I happen to approve of it because I think it's then we can talk about that. But the Democrats, in their wisdom, correctly, as a matter of fact, felt that the consensus, both within the party and within the country, felt that this was the correct course, and they could gain no political profit out of criticizing the president over the thing which, after all, is the proximate cause of this great budget deficit, which is defense spending. And the question is, which is worse, a budget deficit or a power deficit? I would vote for a budget deficit. But so there's...
is what Reagan admits, not only admits, but proclaims. This, to me, is the hidden State of the Union message. Reagan not only admits something, but proclaims it. That everybody feared he was going to do. And he's doing it, and he's doing it joyously, and I can't help but love it. For a long time, there was the suspicion that a conservative Republican was going to be too kind to business. Now, business is the biggest coward in the world. So if the Poles were American businessmen, there would never be a solidarity. American business is afraid to get up and stand up and belt out its point of view. They are overjoyed not to have the knock on their door, indicating in the middle of the night that they are going to be the next one to be regulated or compelled to live up to federal regulations. Business is thrilled to make a truce that you don't enforce that on us right yet. I've never heard of business. Oh, where is the drug industry? They sit there and they let these liberal sharpshooters talk about generic drugs versus labeled drugs and the dumping of bad drugs in the third world and all this nonsense. Where is the first drug man who's going to stand up and say, look, you twerps, under free enterprise where the drug company that invents the good drug gets a protected patent for a long time. We have 1,000 significant drugs in our scrapbook since World War II. The Soviet Union has 0. Zippo, the same number of drugs that Adolf Hitler had with his experimentations on human beings from 1938 through 1940. Now, business doesn't do that. Now, there was an undercurrent in the real world, the business world, that said under the Democrats, and even under Nixon, there was so much regulation. Good Lord, you couldn't. Business went out of business rather than keep the books that were required until just now. Now, Ronald Reagan quietly in the State of the Union address said, we are going to abandon, and I mean, I forget his words, they're better than mine, but what he said was we're going to quit that. We are not going to regulate business nose first corkscrew into the ground. We're going to get off big businesses back. Now, this is a very hard thing to say politically because for 40 years under Democrats and Republicans, it was very popular to be on businesses back. You know, you're against the big ones and for the people. And here comes President Reagan saying, we're going to let business be business. We're going to let business do business. We're going to abandon those myriad rules and regulations. To me, that was like the liberation of Paris. To business, and I'm not going to make a nickel. Not a nickel on all the deregulation. But I think American business is going to be better off, and I think the rest of us are going to be better off. American business, which benefits, is afraid to admit that it even heard what the president said.
It is a very, very complicated issue. That they have been in office for a year. George Bush has headed a task force down there. They've attempted a lot of deregulation. They thought it was going to be very easy. It is not very easy. Carter, in fact, was for deregulation. Even Ted Kennedy is for deregulation. Likes to claim that he started the airline deregulation, and so on and so forth.
Who was for regulation?
Well, I'll tell you who. It's a whole lot of liberals were for regulation of that sort, and even they are souring on it now on some of its more bizarre aspects. But in a modern industrial society, you do need some appreciable amount of regulation. I think we overdid it. I think we overdid it mostly because there was a mentality in Washington for a while, sort of for about a decade, on the part of the regulators. In the back of their mind, they sort of said, hey, business are the bad guys. And then when you interpret with that psychology, when you interpret relatively reasonable regulations, you end up, as you say, screwing these guys to the wall. And that then, the point that Reagan and a lot of us would make is that ends up diminishing economic activity, which when the circle goes around ends up, among other things, hurting poor people. But you do need in this kind of a society, I think, a substantial amount of regulation. I think, for example, the thing in this country, first we listen to sort of a lot of environmental extremists that we must downsize these big gas-guzzling cars. And there was obviously some political and geopolitical, the oil, OPEC, all that kind of stuff, reason for doing it. But all these wonderful people who are advocating a risk-free society, on the one hand, were putting us into little tiny tin boxes, which are very, very dangerous. They're probably going to add 15,000 deaths a year on the downsizing of the fleet. And then comes along an administration that really believes in risk in society and says you don't have to have a seatbelt, automatically because put around your torso because we believe in people taking risks if they want it, and so on and so forth. So what we have done as a society in this crazy quilt dance we're doing on regulation is we've pushed a lot of people into little, small, unsafe cars, and then we said you don't have to wear seatbelts, and you're going to end up with a lot of dead Americans because we don't understand how to regulate. There is a role for regulation.
Well, you're saying that you can't.
I'll just tell you something about those welfare cuts. You know, I've gone through those budgets, and you know, something very, very funny is happening. And it goes back to one word, which is the word cut. And it turns out that the word cut in Washington does not mean what the word cut means in English. They are two very, very different phenomena. And people keep talking about a cut in the rate of increase. And that's what you've had. You've had a cut in the rate of increase. Increase for the human services budget of the federal budget, believe it or not, continues to go up. Admittedly up at a slower rate. But that is a very, very long way away from saying that we are turning back the Great Society. I worked for...
So I think it matters.
No, but that's not true that people are starving. I mean, let me put it this way. If people are starving, they are not starving because what has happened so far in federal government expenditures. I mean, that's, you know, you have 20 million people still on food stamps. The people they knocked off food stamps, as I understand it, and I've gone through this, are the people at the top end of the eligibility range, all right, who are at 130% of the poverty level or whatever. They are not people, and I'm not saying they're not hard-pressed. They are hard-pressed. These are difficult economic times. But, you know, the cuts have not been either total or involving the poorest people, the poorest segment of the society. That is that at least is the tale that the numbers tell.
Oh, I know.
This sum of money, this deficit game that they're playing now, and you were into it before, Sidney, is really weird. We grew up in democratic politics with all our patron saint economists for 25 years saying those Republicans are crazy when they say that deficits in and of themselves are harmful. There's nothing wrong with a little deficit. It depends, you know, how big the economy is. And people don't really, even this $100 billion deficit, which probably is too high and it's got to come down, but a $100 billion deficit on a $4 trillion economy estimated in 1984 is about the level of deficits that Eisenhower was running. It is not some bizarre runaway number. And for Democrats, for liberals, to be suddenly demanding a balanced budget is like Casanova coming out for chastity. You know, it's crazy.
It's good. That had been this is before the 1982 State of the Union address. The President of the United States made no secret
that was
his
interview with
intention.
President Ronald Roosevelt.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I must say that I am thrilled with the prospect of what might yet ensue, in spite of all the pain and the angst and everything. Because to continue on the same course, I don't see how anybody can seriously disagree with the President. To continue on the same course is the definition of disaster. Maybe Sidney Zion can disagree. I hope he won't. I haven't had an argument with him since 1962.
When we didn't meet yet.
No, but I knew about you. I knew about you. Because however much you disapprove of what President Reagan is doing, had he not done something neck-wrenching, dramatic, had we merely continued, had President Reagan been the kind of person who says, wait a minute, how can we re-gimmick disaster? There are many ways to re-gimmick disaster so it doesn't look like disaster. The band on the Titanic can play a different kind of tune. They can have a social director running around deck barking about a new kind of shuffleboard contest. There are all kinds of ways to re-gimmick disaster. But it's hard to disguise disaster for a very long time. Whenever I get pained by something Ronald Reagan is doing now, I imagine the alternative. And it becomes very easy to accept my role in the new nation, which is to do without some things and some expectations, and to wince as some unfortunate people suffer. This is a major thing going on. This is not just a president who says, okay, I think I'll play this one and that one and that one, and let's see how it works. There's a major thing going on. I don't think the president gets credit enough for instituting a major thing. This is not just a typical president with a bunch of advisors around him say, hey, we won't really rock any boat, but we'll put on a new disguise and a new label.
What you're doing is your people benefit. The Democrats, everybody believes that in order to reignite this economy, you have got to go through this process of capital formation, and that means incentives for businesses.
I am itching worse than Sidney to get to the Middle East and around the world. But at some point, in some broadcast, if not this one, somebody will please do me a favor and explain to me what's so bad about trickle down. It's one of the few economic theories I can understand. It is hired, pal, You are hired, ma'am, in this new growth industry by my desperate friend who can't grow fast enough, even though the demand is there, because he can't hire the people. Now, this, to me, trickled down as a great idea begging to happen. If only we would let a few people achieve, and I think deregulation is going to do a lot of that. I think the mere climate that business is no longer ipso facto a war criminal in the eyes of the administration. The mere fact that people are allowed to succeed and then let their success trickle down in the form of their itching, festering, seeking, reaching, giving mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to new layers of employees who are all of a sudden necessary. My soul, this is the best economic theory in the history of the world. I can't imagine anybody standing up and just ritualistically insulting trickle down.
Well, the administration is going on a course that if it isn't disaster for America, it won't be for Israel. It would be surprising to me, you know. And it's certainly nothing that Reagan talked about in his campaign and that made me, more than any other single issue, vote for him. I think that the notion that the Middle East, the linchpin of the Middle East is the Saudi Arabian government is about as crazy as you can get. And I'm convinced that, and I wasn't convinced right away because it was so crazy that was their policy, but it is their policy. They want a NATO in the Middle East that is linchpinned by a country that, I don't like the pun, is so shaky that when they had 200 people, religious fanatics in a mosque, they had to call the French in and get rid of them, and the princes all had their bags packed to leave the country. Now, this is what they think is going to save American interests in the Middle East. Back the Golan Heights to Syria to use, you know, to target practice against Israelis downtown. And I thought that was a major overreaction on the part of the United States. And then again, I don't think that Reagan is surprised at all. Was he the same guy you voted for on this issue?
Sidney, you're being shrill.
I'm trying to be nice and easy, though.
Can't stand to see a good man get shrill.
Shrill?
Now, wait a minute.
I haven't even begun to get shrill.
Wait a minute.
I haven't told you anything about anything.
In 1954, Confidential magazine, you remember that one, wrote a blistering expose of the late Groucho Marx, all about young girls and all kinds of tacky things that Groucho Marx was alleged to be into. And his friends came to him and said, "Are you going to take that? Aren't you going to? Are you just going to let this go down?" And Groucho Marx said, "Absolutely not. I'm not going to let this go down. I have written a letter to the publishers of Confidential warning them. One more article like that and I cancel my subscription." Now, wasn't that more or less the United States reaction, really, to the annexation by Israel of the Golan Heights? I mean, didn't Secretary of State Haig say, interestingly early, this storm will pass?
Well, the Saudi connection is being exploited in a strange way by this administration. I would agree with Sidney on that. It's a strange post to hang your defense upon. I think it's an overstatement what Sidney's saying. I mean, you know, the basic idea is to set up, as you say, a NATO in which the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Jordanians and a few other people would all be players, and whether that is naive remains to be seen. I mean, in fairness, nobody would have thought 5 years ago that Israel and Egypt could now be where they are. So let's see.
Violence in the Middle East comprises 80% of what used to be Palestine. In other words, if you want a Palestinian homeland, congratulations, your aspiration is complete. We have one. It's going under an assumed name, Jordan. 80% of what used to be Palestine in non-Israeli hands at the moment. So Sidney Zion can paste that in his scrapbook. Or either Ben Wattenberg, David Weed. I mean, none of you is one of these sycophant characters on the American scene who says, surrender, surrender, surrender. You know, I would love to know from these people who tell us, don't mess around with Poland. We gave Poland to the Soviet Union. Poland is in the Soviet orbit. Poland is theirs. Don't you send flashlight batteries to Solidarity or it's World War III, because Poland is irrevocably theirs. I can understand that. I mean, look at the map, look at Yalta, look at the history of Eastern Europe since 1940. I understand that Poland is, quote, theirs, unquote. But if we are to be so respectful of Poland being theirs, then why isn't Cuba ours? Why isn't Nicaragua ours? Why isn't El Salvador ours? Why must we always bow and touch our foreheads on the floor in front of the altar of communism and respect their power and where they hold sway, while at the same time considering it absolutely normal that they use Cuban troops, Soviet power, every single trick in and out of the books to destabilize non-communist government? Why is it normal that they try and succeed to take over non-communist countries, including those right inside our vest? But for us to do anything to encourage freedom in Poland is provocation for World War III. Now, friends, members of the Committee in Support of Solidarity are with us. Irene Lasota, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at Fordham U. Eric I'm in trouble. How do you do it? Chenoweth. Doesn't sound too Polish.
It's not.
Oh, dear me. Director of the Polish Workers' Task Force, founding member of the Committee in Support of Solidarity. Jakub Karpinski is with us again. He was a sociologist in Poland. He's a Polish citizen, teaches philosophy and mass communications. Respectfully. You are, of course, excused for concentrating upon Poland. There is another communist country at the bottom of Europe called Albania. Are you aware of what's going on in Albania tonight?
Terrible things.
Are you aware of that? I plead guilty not to being aware of that. I had to be grabbed by the collar by my Albanian friends and shaken into awakenness. Irene, are you in tune with what's going on in Albania?
Yes, because I have been working for years with Amnesty International, and already 3 years ago I was averting amnesty in London that there is a forgotten country which is altogether a concentration camp.
Well, Albania is probably the toughest communist dictatorship in the world today. They still have the statue of Joseph Stalin. They got very angry at Russia when Russia turned against Stalin in the Khrushchev era, 20th Party Congress, March 1952.
They even published in the late 60s a report in the party newspaper saying that they finally achieved full atheism in the country because they shot the last bishop.
They shot the, exactly, all right, achieved full atheism by shooting the last bishop. Now, if you don't study Albania like I do, you may not believe what I'm going to say. You may think you're watching Saturday Night Live on television. I'm sorry, folks. Here's the way it is, and I thank the Polish delegation for stepping aside and letting me deal first with Albania. And if the Albanian delegation arrives, I may do most of this all over again. It's not a lick amiss, as Tom Sawyer's aunt said when she swatted him. He said, "What's that for?" And she said, "Well, if you don't know, I do, or if I don't know, you do," or something. It's not a lick amiss to be doing Albania twice, because nobody else in the media does it even once, no matter what goes on there.
It's very abrupt.
Going on, right. Communism doesn't like things to go on. They like to end things very, very quickly, because communism has learned that if it ends things quickly, no matter how brutally, it gets away with it in that Supreme Court of the world, which is the hearts and minds of men. I think the most relevant story to hark back to right now is Khrushchev's visit to America in 1959. Now, mind you, the repression of the Hungarian Revolution was 3 years earlier. Tanks, troops, gunfire, massive annihilation of Hungarians. 1956. 1959, Khrushchev comes to America, and the press surrounds him. "Oh, how do you like America? How long are you going to stay? What are you going to talk to the president about? Oh, Mr. Khrushchev, what do you most want to see? Mr. Khrushchev, do you think they're going to give you a visa so you can see Disney World or Disneyland?" Really? Not a word of the above is made up. One reporter in that group in 1959 said, "Mr. Khrushchev, the Hungarians were slaughtered by your troops 3 years ago. The situation in Hungary today, and Khrushchev snarled at him. In America, surrounded by American free newsmen, Khrushchev said, "Can't you get that dead rat out of your throat?" And I remember the entire American press corps sided with Khrushchev. You think all this stuff is new, folks. In 1959, the entire American press corps sympathized with Khrushchev, was very embarrassed that he had been asked a question by an American newsman about Hungary. And they agreed, the American heroes of the press, that Khrushchev was an honored guest, and it was supremely bad taste to bring up the Hungarian Revolution. Now, this is in a free country, Irene.
But today, the same is happening. Did you read Flora Lewis yesterday?
Well, tell us what's happening. Well, we forgot about little Albania. Their wartime leader, Enver Hoxha, Hoxja. Forgive me, folks, I did not invent the Albanian language. Hoxja, Enver Hoxha, was alive and well, maybe tonight, but maybe not. He was the leader of Albania in 1945, turned the country to communist, gave it to Russia, broke from China later on, remained an independent, ardent dictatorship, communist style. The story is, fasten your seatbelt. Do you really need a break right now? Because the audience, the FCC is going to get me on a teasing charge. I only promise you this, if you stay tuned, you will never have heard anything like this about any nation politically. Ever, or at least since the 1700s, or where I'm making this up, or ate a funny mushroom. None of the above. Here is the news from Albania. There was a leader, the second in command, Mehmet Shehu. He was in America in 1960 when the world went insane and everybody came to America. Remember, all the communist leaders came on a ship, Khrushchev, Janos Kadar of Hungary, Tito came, the Romanian, the Polish, all the communist leaders came to New York City, the United States of America, for the opening round. That was the famous chicken plucking thing with Fidel Castro. Well, the Albanians sent Mehmet Shehu, number 2, under Enver Hoxha. And Shehu came, and we heard stories about Shehu from Albanian resistors, Albanian patriots, Albanian anti-communists. And I couldn't believe them. All refugees exaggerate. If I leave no law unto the world that can be proved, please accept this as Farber's Law, number 001. Refugees exaggerate. Okay, that's the first thing you have to learn. However, sometimes, even after the exaggeration is dwindled back down, you still have monumental things to discuss. I heard in 1960 that Shehu, who was called the Butcher, used to get in a Jeep and go from Albanian village to Albanian village with a revolver and shoot homosexuals in the square, among others. But the communists didn't like homosexuals, and fine, that's it. Shehu apparently came to America incognito a very short time ago, looking for a way back into the good graces of the United States. Well, stranger things have happened. Red China.
You mean for Albania or for himself?
No, for Albania. For Albania. To bring Albania into the Western orbit, trade with America and all the rest. I mean, that's nothing new. When Albania was the most communist of communist states and Greece was a fascist state under the colonels, then they opened the border and started trading for the first time since 1945. So there are such things as accommodations in love and war and politics. Anyhow, Mehmet Shehu, and don't be startled when I mention accommodations. Don't act like a rat thrown across the floor and you got to stand up on the table and squeal. Israel is at war with Jordan and the border is open and they sell watermelons across it and Jordanians come into what is now the West Bank belongs to Israel and they visit their relatives and all kinds of et cetera. So Mehmet Shehu sneaked into America a short time ago, the story goes, to try to win support for Albania's getting back in with the United States. When he got back to Albania, his boss, Enver Hoxha, who I don't know whether he used the present tense or the past tense, this is part of the story. He had a vivid, living, organic, natural, lustrous hatred of America. And Enver Hoxha pulled out his revolver, and the number one man in the country shot the number 2 man. 4 forced him to commit suicide. Now, bizarrely enough, and I now rely on the New York Times, which I don't often do, but occasionally, the New York Times quoted the American government as saying, bizarre as it sounds, there may be truth in that story, bizarre as it is, because it was a Yugoslav report. But the American government said it could not discount it because the American government wisely listened to the Albanian radio. Now, communism is inflexible. We are flexible. We are boxers dancing around on tiptoe in the middle of the ring, throwing flurries of lefts and rights as compared to a communist regime. Under communism, if Mehmet Shehu had really committed suicide or really died a natural death, the communist press would have been filled with eulogies, obituaries, our great revolutionary leader, the Albanian Stalin himself.
If he died a natural death, not a suicide, I shouldn't think.
Yes. Albanian official announcement of Shehu's death was so curt. It just said, it was 15 seconds. Mind you now, he's the number 2 man in Albania since 1945. His demise is covered in a matter of 15 seconds, and that's the end of it. Comrade Mehmet Shehu, in a moment of extreme nervous tension, destroyed himself with a revolver, and then back to business, back to music. Now, one says, wait a minute, the communists aren't that dumb. If they want to give the impression that he really did commit suicide or really did have a heart attack, then why don't they, they own the radio, they own the television, they own the newspapers, why don't they go into a big deal, crocodile tear thing? Sorry, folks, that's the way we think. Communism doesn't do that. If they didn't like him, if those in charge didn't like him when he died, then they do it in 15 seconds, even though it tips off to the enemies of Albania, namely freedom lovers around the world. Even though that lets us know the truth, communism is too inflexible to keep us from knowing the truth.
I think you're approaching another myth. It's very clear.
As David Schulte says, thank you for clearing that. In other words, the communists don't have the flexibility to gimmick. They didn't like him. They killed him. They did it in 15 seconds in their news, and life goes on. They didn't have the flexibility to pretend that it was natural or anything the way other countries might. But Shehu's brother-in-law then took a gun and killed Enver Hoxha, number 1.
Terrific.
Number 1.
They're all dead.
Number 1, and 6 other people. And 6 other people. All we know is that wires to Albania are cut. Leslie, will you please see if the wires to Albania are still cut? Play dumb. Play very dumb. You get good cooperation that way. Pick up the phone. Tell the operator you'd like to place a call to Tirana, Tirana. You'd like to call Tirana, Albania. If she demands to know who you're calling, say you'd like to call Enver, Enver, Hoxha, Hoxja. He's in the presidential palace. Or
this is a nice girl from Maine. She'll never get that straight.
All right. But just give me the report later on. I understand that all wires to Albania have been cut, which, again, communist style, lets us know, whether they want us to know or not, that something dire is happening in Albania. Now, once upon a time, and we have history on our side right now, America is a democracy. Our people can do whatever they please politically. Once upon a time, our people, thanks to leadership, inspiration, agitation, propaganda, great numbers, millions of Americans rallied to support the Viet Cong in one way or another. Our government, being a democracy, could not stop them, did not stop them, did not try to stop them. There were marches, there were Viet Cong flags, there were delegations, there was money, there were exhortations, declarations, proclamations, all for the Viet Cong. Now turn the page. It is now our turn. History has given us a foothold. They call it a beachhead in war. They call it a chance in football. They call it a purchase. My gout doctor calls it a purchase when he's trying to stick a needle into my veins or stick some colchicine in there, and I clench my fist and give him a good sheet of blue right there. We now have an edge. We have an opportunity. We can sink mud cleats and grab traction inside this opportunity. After Hungary, there was nothing to do. After Czechoslovakia, there was nothing to do. But it's not after Poland yet, because the Polish thing has broken our way, not the Soviet way, not the Soviet Union's way. It's no longer a smoking crater and defeated people. It is still going on in Poland. So if Americans want to, we can still help the freedom forces. When we get back together, words and melody as to how. Freeze frame, Munich number 2. Everybody my age wishes you could go back to Munich and say, gee, wake up, world. We're never going to get caught in this kind of thing again. The free nations yawning and disunited, only the dictators together in a clenched fist. Wow, we're never going to make that mistake again. And here on our radio, it says, Western Europe is divided on sanctions about Poland. We don't really have allies on this. Our world is scattered. Well, I hope like I lived to study the history of Munich, other freedom-loving youngsters will live to study the history of Poland, 1980, 1981, and now 1982. My partner for the broadcast, anything you want.
And the total information blockade, which is lasting until today, more or less, and the problem was how to break this blockade, how to counteract the disinformation of the Polish junta.
The disinformation, in other words, the confusion that they deliberately spread.
I think they are using several tactics. One is the confusion, but the other one is, of course, disinformation, to send false information, and especially to charm the Western media and to try to convince them about their idea, what they want the Western media to respond. I would say that even now it's a little bit better. The information now that you can read in the New York Times sometimes is close to what is happening in Poland, but the first days were, I would say, terrible. Everybody was confused who is General Jaruzelski, and some people are saying he's a great Polish patriot. He saved Poland. He had a tantalizing speech. He was a great man, and he was saving Poland from economic chaos. Now, the problem was also to try to bring a good information to show that at least all of those things are questionable. And we are getting information from the first day, because there was...
So how were you doing it?
We started to call Europe, especially Sweden was our first source of information, because on the third day of the state of war, the ferry service between Poland and Sweden resumed. And there were some sailors, Swedish citizens, Belgian citizens, Dutch citizens, who were coming out of Poland with the first stories that the moment of the declaration of state of war meant that tens of thousands of people were rounded out between midnight and 6 a.m., and that those people were interned in terrible conditions. First of all, the American embassy became also a prisoner in Poland. It's very funny.
Well, let's be careful in
the... I'm saying, yes, they are prisoners, and they don't want to say about it openly. So I was spoke with a Polish citizen who told me how America can be silent when their embassy really became a prison. The embassy is totally surrounded. There was a decree that the diplomats are not to leave their quarters. The embassy is surrounded by two rows of soldiers, and the Polish citizens are not even allowed to walk on the same side of the street where the embassy is.
Well, I think...
Of information in 1962.
Why? Everybody knows what I mean by the face on that Frenchman. Or if you don't know what I mean, then you're of a different ethos, and I hope you will want to learn what I mean instead of just sneering at me for being old-fashioned. There was a face, a mask of pain and humiliation. They photographed the face of one Frenchman in 1940 as the Nazi tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées, and his face was just a mask of pain. And that face became a symbol of France's defeat and a rallying point for eventual liberation of France. Why was that man crying? Not just because Nazi tanks ruled him. He didn't look Jewish to me. He would probably live out World War II, get fewer of those long slices of bread, ride his bicycle a little bit less through blackouts, have a little bit less pâté. He would probably make it personally through World War II. But it was the fact that he knew that France was decadent and did nothing, was indecisive, and deliberately got weak and played games while Germany armed, and now, bang, it all came to pass. In football, That's the face of the safety man when the wide receiver gets behind him and catches the game-winning touchdown pass. Same kind of pain, except in sports and not in real life. Well, if America and the West ever collapse, I don't want to have the face of that pained Frenchman. I want to know that I did my part and the rest of the West let me down. I don't care what happens to me personally. That man was crying because he felt it was his fault. I sense that. He was also... I am old enough now that if, God forbid, the West collapses, I will not have that mask of pain. I will feel that I've done my part verbally, marching, donating, mimeographing, ringing doorbells, raising money, and we're going to do that right now with Solidarity. I'll feel I've done my part, so you're not going to catch me crying like that Frenchman. And I'm old enough now, regardless of what my personal fate will be under communism, I'm old enough now to smile and say, you bastards. The rest of you have it coming to you. Look what you did and look what you didn't do. Now look what the West is not doing right now. Business as usual.
Today, which came from Vienna, somebody smuggled a bulletin of solidarity, which is something that Jakub is talking about. Solidarity is producing bulletins, although it's not, people are not allowed to buy paper in stores in Poland. Paper is banned in Poland, not only newspaper, but clean sheet of paper, you cannot go and buy it. And still there are bulletins. And in those bulletins you see that it's true, Poles are killing Poles, but there are also Polish soldiers who rebelled against the Polish officers. And it was not a clear division, the army is here, the police is here, and the nation, or maybe the workers are on the other side. The division goes all throughout the nation, and it's not such a clear cut.
It is every American people write to you and send money or whatever. How can people help specific? How can we who want freedom and the defeat of communism do for Poland what so many Americans who felt the opposite did to help communism in Vietnam? What can we do individually now? Name, address, etc. She, on her instructions, called Albania just to see if it's possible to get through. Lines to Albania have been open in recent years. Something big, really, really, really big, is definitely going on inside Albania. We don't know what. The leader apparently shot the second-in-command. The brother-in-law of the second-in-command shot and killed the leader and 6 other people. That's the report that's buzzing around the Albanian exile community all throughout the world. Albanians are really enriching the telephone company now, calling each other from New York, Brazil, Australia, Tokyo, Paris, trying to get the word, and that is the word. I asked Leslie Warren to call Albania. She was blocked. She bloodied her nose in a frontal call to Albania. They tried to get in through Romania, and even through communist Romania, the lines to Albania are down. So, confirmation that communications are cut, which tends to support the theory that big things are going on inside communist Albania. We know little or nothing about them. Free trade union, if you read the 21 demands, I got into Solidarity early because I went into the small print and read the 21 demands. This was no workers' uprising. Apologists for the Polish communist regime, pro-communists, do-nothing Americans, and plain old people who just take the news as it is served them, called it a workers'... They acted like it was some kind of labor dispute and the Polish workers were unhappy with labor conditions. Yeah. For about 4 or 5 of the 21 demands, it did look like a workers' protest. They wanted more meat and no work on Saturday. But if you read the other 18 demands, this was an anti-communist uprising, and it was obvious from the first day that we ever heard of Solidarity. No censorship in the press, access to the media. I mean, the whole thing was there. And communism must be getting a little soft in the saddle because it knew that it was an anti-communist uprising in August of 1980, and it did not know what to do for all those months, and it did little. In fact, it did nothing until it was absolutely forced to at bayonet point from the Soviet Union. Eric, are you...
Well, maybe with this question one can say that the General Jaruzelski is one of the biggest traitors in Polish history. It was inconceivable for the Soviets to enter into Poland in mass numbers, because now they have still 30,000, but invade Poland. before the 30s because it was obvious that all the nation would fight. After 3 weeks of the state of war, General Jaruzelski maybe prepared Poland for a Soviet invasion.
But Valenza can be imprisoned, and what a disgrace to the West to be talking, to have any communications while the leader of Solidarity is not free. If I were president, you folks better be damn glad I'm not president, because if I were president, my conscience would not allow me to have any dialogue with the communist world until Lech Valenza were free to negotiate. I mean, you commies would have to give him a house, his own choice of servants and aides and attendants, his own teletype, his own ability to snap a finger and have
what would you do?
Free access to the media. No, but the
people have been exchanging goods outside the state-owned market.
Was it always that way since the beginning of communism in 1945?
It was practiced during the German occupation, and it persisted. Something more. There was a second society outside the communist framework. People were trying to establish something themselves, and the economy is just an example. So it is what I mean when I am speaking about the efforts to rebuild the Polish society. These efforts are being done from the very beginning of communist Poland. People have been resisting all the time. Resistance is nothing new. Government robbery. The government in Poland blocked all the money on the bank accounts. So maybe these are that money.
Imagine that the Soviets, as part of a tactic beginning détente and before that peaceful coexistence and normalization of relations with the West, can you believe that the disciplined Soviet Union became an addict to Western trade, became hooked on commercial relations with the West, and now depends on commercial relations with the West credit? Can you imagine telling Joseph Stalin, imagine you're a member of the Soviet Politburo and your job is to go to the Kremlin and tell Joseph Stalin he's got to clean up his act because otherwise the West will withdraw credit? And would you now do if you had the famous magic wand, magic American wand? People feelings have a simple answer to that. They say Farber and his kind would nuke them all, simply push the button and destroy the world with nuclear weapons. Well, they hadn't got the guts or the brains to stand up and face the issues. What I would do is tell the communist world, look, nice try, very nice try, starting with nothing 60 years ago. You almost made it. You had us on the ropes, coming from nowhere like a genie out of a bottle, like a volcano belching lava, like a typhoon coming out of a wet paper bag. Bang! You people almost did it. You had a little luck. You had a very evil man named Hitler who engendered an awful lot of hostility. You all mobilized that hostility. Hitler did communism the favor of attacking communism, meaning that everybody who hated Hitler loved communism or helped communism. You got some breaks. You got some breaks. But a lot of people get breaks and don't do what you communists did in 60 years. You almost had us. But you didn't make it. A lot of touchdown plays wind up on the 1-yard line and die there. And I like to think communism is one of those forgive me, Poles, for talking American football. I think that this is one of those things that didn't quite make it. There's a very meaningful statue in the Soviet Union. I think it's the world's only horizontal statue. And I approve of this statue because I can't abandon my love of the Soviet Union in World War II when they did so much to help us defeat Hitler. There is a statue in the Soviet Union, horizontal, of a German soldier on his belly with his hands outstretched, showing the closest a Nazi soldier got to Moscow. Well, it is bizarre, and they didn't fake it. It's true. The closest Nazi soldier got to within inches of the goal line, to within inches of the Moscow city limits. It looks like a football play. You know, you ever see him out there? He wants to make a touchdown. He sticks his hand out, and the referee says, sorry, no touchdown. Well, the Nazis did not score. They did not take Moscow. They did not break the Soviet Union. And I would say now to communism, nice try, fellas. You almost got us too, but some things went wrong. The American blacks did not rise up and join you. the American intellectuals and left-wingers did not succeed in their assignment of weakening us.
Statement for the front page of already.
You cannot always put important answers onto a fortune cookie or a bumper sticker. Some take a little more time, a little more graphics than the head of a pen. I would say to communism, nice try. You almost made it, but you didn't. You have lost. Now, you're now involved in repressing your own internal contradictions, your own people rising up against you. I would say we are going to do at least as much for freedom as you have done for communism around the world. Now, we are nuclear, and you are nuclear. You are ready. We are ready. We are not, as Winston Churchill pointed out, made of sugar candy. We're going to put the full course press on you, the full court press. We are going to aid all freedom forces on the planet Earth that we can reach. You may do it gracefully. You may do it violently. We are ready. I do not think they would push a nuclear button. I think they would gulp and try to maintain their position, try to maintain their gains, hedge their losses, sort of like people. Sort of like people. I don't believe in the mad dictator. Really, but I would say to them, we will have nothing to do with you. We will not give toy sanctions. We will give meaningful sanctions.
You cut off the grain, everything.
Absolutely everything. All grain, all technology, all tourism, all art. Cut them off completely. Let them drip dry. They are fortunately dependent on some Western trade. I would turn then to our allies who balked. And I would say, sorry, you gave us Munich, but you weren't looking. We had to swallow Munich, and we were looking, and we're not going to buy another one. If you cannot help us, do not hinder us. I am not interested in a Soviet natural gas pipeline that paralyzes the West Germans. There is such a thing as risk. There is such a thing as danger. There's such a thing as honorable death. I prefer risking everything the West has to giving it away, to namby-pambying our way to a more certain destruction.
I agree with it.
Up now. Stand up now. And I'll tell you something. It's not such a courageous thing because in football they have scouts. In history we have observers. Our observations tell us that every time we have stood up, they have backed down. Now, folks, if we get incinerated, and if you happen to find me in the nuclear ashes, don't lay your trip on me. I will still say, given what we faced, it was the correct thing for us to have done. The incorrect thing is to give the world another Munich. We hate what's going on in Poland, says Helmut Schmidt. We despise what's going on in Poland pains me. I'm sure Poland gives Helmut Schmidt burping attacks. But there's that natural gas pipeline and those billions of dollars of contracts about to be thrown off to Western Europe. And I say right here, we're now back to the old American Legion movies where one of the guys in the white helmet draws a line in the sand with his sword. And if you step across that line, you're a man, and if not, I forget what you are. But it is down to that, and I say now is the time to press. Now's the time to let the Russians know they have blown it. Nice try. They almost got us, but they lost us, and now they can be graceful, or they can be omnidestructive, mutually destructive, and envelop the world in a nuclear holocaust. I'll not have another Munich. Press the Soviet Union, capitalize on the Soviet Union's weakness, and force them not to invade Poland by the full weight of our sanctions.
I just want to add a few more ideas how to do it. There are already over 2 years that Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviet Union, and the Afghans are begging for arms, but nobody wants to give them. You have the people from Nicaragua who started the revolution against Somoza, who are now in Florida, begging for arms because they want to fight the totalitarian in Nicaragua. There are places in Africa where the Soviets should be stopped, and they are not being stopped, because when Kissinger asked for some funds to stop the Soviets in Africa, of course the Congress thought it was too much. Why shouldn't we fight the Soviets in Africa? So I agree. I just would go a little bit further.
And remember that Soviets are not afraid of giving arms to the people they back.
No, exactly. How long is that going to go on? The Soviet Union, to their credit, they don't sneak around. They don't lift up their collars on trench coats and look both ways and dart across alleys. They openly, proclaimedly support communist insurrection, rebellion, destabilization around the world. We do nothing.
A point like that never happened. In Yalta agreement, there was a clause about Poland which said free elections are to be organized as soon as possible. Free elections in Poland have never been organized.
And the biggest injustice is that the wave of hatred engulfs the memory of Senator Joseph McCarthy. And I hold no brief for him, his 5 o'clock shadow, his tactics, his bumpkin Wisconsin accent. But the real wave of indignation should fall upon the American liberals after World War II. Look what happened. We conquered Western Europe and reinstalled democracy in every country where David Schulte and his colleagues liberated. Norway, Nazi-occupied, freed, democracy today. Denmark, Nazi-occupied, freed, democracy today. Ditto, Holland, ditto, Belgium, ditto, France. Where Russia came, they simply brought limousines from Moscow with locally trained communist leaders of those countries, and they were installed in power. Rákosi in Hungary, Anna Palker in Romania, what was his name in Poland? Bierut, yeah. And they became the puppets. Now, where was the forget Joe McCarthy, he came along in 1951 or something. Where was the American liberal for those 6 years who said, wait a damn minute, we're not going to stand for this. We sacrificed all that American blood to end that kind of thing. That's called aggression. That's called tyranny. What do you mean the Poles are run from Moscow? What do you mean the Romanians are run from Moscow? The part of Europe that we liberated is now free, and the part that our gallant Russian allies liberated is now enslaved? What's the meaning of this? The American liberal had not just the opportunity, but the obligation for the 6 years before we ever heard of Joe McCarthy to stand up and say, foul, fraud. This is a consumer fraud.
Except I don't. Helmut Schmidt has too much stock in Western trade to the Soviet Union to want to see that, because that would be the final straw. But from a humanitarian standpoint, from a standpoint of supporting freedom, that is not what we want to see at all.
What would you like to Schmidt, in his interview to the New York Times, just mentioned Yalta agreement. As I said now, Yalta was also an agreement about free elections. So if some European politicians are so much for Yalta, why aren't they also for the free elections in Poland? If Helmut Schmidt is a defender of Yalta agreement, why he is not for the free elections? And it was just what the referendum was supposed to be about.
Wait, stop. You have made a telling point, and I want to help you tell it. For years, we anti-communists were put down as hysterical witch hunters for daring to say the stupid, uneducated, parakeet, paranoid party line that said, we gave Eastern Europe to the Soviets at Yalta. That was considered the proof that you know nothing, the proof that you're a political dolt, the proof that you are beneath political respect, was to say from 1945 until just lately, we gave Poland away at Yalta. Well, now, folks, the mask is off. And who are the political dolts? Who are the know-nothings? Now Helmut Schmidt, in telling why he's not going to apply sanctions, says, well, after all, we gave Eastern Europe to the Russians at Yalta. That's an agreement.
But if so, then under some conditions, and these conditions have never been fulfilled.
There was a free elections clause in that?
Yes.
I'm in your debt. I'm in your debt. I never heard that.
Yes, and even more. Solidarity was a very democratic movement, and Solidarity was always assuming the Communist Party would exist. They just wanted to limit its hold over the society.
No more conjecture. No more guessing. We will simply yield to you, and you give us your shopping list. The Viet Cong gave American leftists their shopping list, and American leftists by the millions in sit-ins and marches and teach-ins did the job for the Viet Cong. Now let's see if this generation of Americans will do the job for you, for solidarity. I can't wait to find out. We're now shrunken, and we're inside the tumor. We now see the disease of the West. Here it is, folks. There is no such thing as a group in Moscow. Pretend Canada despises the Canadian government and there's martial law and they can't wait to rebel. Let's say they hunger for communism from one end of Canada to the other. And there's a group of Canadian communists in Moscow, and they try to find an office, and they try to get some typewriters, and their phone bill is 5,000 rubles, and they can't pay it. So they go out of business. There is no such thing as that. They have all the money. As long as they can use that money to further communism in Canada, they are going to have all the money, all the resources they need from the Kremlin treasury. Okay? Now turn the page. Here the committee in support of solidarity. No support, no help, they have a phone bill of $5,000, no idea of how they're going to pay it. Now, Irene, we've got a few minutes left. We've given your address, we'll give it again. We are now
politicians. And this, I think you talked a lot. There are congressmen, senators. There are also banks. Now, if the banks are not being stopped from financing the Polish junta, then it's not very good for the Polish workers. Another thing that I'm trying to go as fast as possible is to help simply the Polish workers whom the government wants to starve. There are several agencies, we are not one of them, which are dealing with helping the Polish nation to survive the communism. One of them I know is very reliable, the Catholic Relief Services, which provides, sends food not to the government, but to the church in Poland. Now, the military junta confiscated almost all medication, they confiscated blood, plasma, people are dying of all types of diseases. It's very good for people to organize themselves, maybe in professional groups, and try to send medication to Poland through either International Red Cross, or, first of all, everybody who wants to help Poland should use his imagination. He can directly try to collect, let's say, blood and send it. He can organize a group of physicists and press the government, the American government and the Soviet government, saying we don't want to see any Soviet physicists as long as the Polish physicists are in jail. The same can go for students, for workers. Now, the unions are doing very well here, so I'm not going to advise the unions in the United States that they should go a little bit further, but they know what to do.